Welcome back to the John Fredericks Radio Show. This is Mike Rubino. Right now we have Eric Bovim. Eric, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Hopefully you've had your
Hi, Mike.
coffee.
Good morning. Had a lot of espresso. I've been up since 4. I'm ready to go.
Good,
Trump.
because we have a lot to talk about. Eric, I want to dive in because you are a PR and messaging guru. You've been in D.C. You've worked for some of the biggest corporations in the world. Let's look at the Trump campaign and the White House as a corporation, right? Corporations, White Houses, politicians, they all need messaging. They need a core set of messaging to utilize and to refer back to, so that people who follow along and who have the ability to digest that information can use it to make an informed decision as to who they want to vote for. So I turn to you and basically say, one, what do you think of the president's messaging so far? What do you think of the campaign's messaging so far? And what do you think they can do to add to that, to bolster their message?
Well, Mike, you said campaign, and I say what campaign? Brad Parscale and his team are running really a marketing effort to promote the Trump brand, and they're not running a political campaign to sell ideas. And, what do I mean by that? The president really hasn't offered any sort of concrete policy ideas for what he would do for his next 4 years. In other words, there's no rationale as to why you should reelect him. It was a bit sad to watch his rally in Tulsa a couple weeks ago. It was kind of a golden oldies of things that he said he had done, but there was nothing really that he would say that he would do. And I think that's really the central premise or flawed premise of the current Trump campaign, quote unquote, is they're not telling anyone what they would do. It's kind of a long airing of the grievances against the media, the people, and just generally complaints about why he's being mistreated. And I don't think that's a rationale to get reelected, especially when his opponent is offering concrete policy ideas. The other issue I have with the campaign is they seem to think that this Sleepy Joe, Corrupt Joe moniker is going to be a reason to get people to vote for Trump.
Well, it's essentially a redux of the Hillary argument, right?
Well, not even. I mean, at least with Hillary, they would say she was crooked Hillary, and
Eric, do we still have Eric? Sounds like we lost him. That's we'll be sure to have him call right back in. Well, in the meantime, I think it's a perfect opportunity to discuss cancel culture, something that has really revved my engines. And if he does call back, I'm going to promise every listener that I'm going to, go off on this. Oh, we have Eric back on. Listeners, you will get to hear me talk about cancel culture. Eric, so you were saying?
Yeah, I think that just making an argument against a candidate because he's in his basement is not really an argument to unelect somebody or to not elect somebody. They need to say, if I were advising the Trump campaign, and I said this yesterday to a Democrat friend, that Joe Biden is not necessarily in control of his party, and he is at the whim of the progressive and left-wing elements of his party. And if elected, Trump needs to say, he's going to do X, Y, and Z. Raise taxes, open borders, universal health care, all these things that Republicans believe are harmful to the United States and the economy. Trump's not saying that. He's just saying Joe's hiding, Joe's cognitive decline. There's sort of ad hominem attacks rather than attacks on what the apocalyptic future of Joe Biden might bring to the United States, according to Trump.
And how would you define that apocalyptic future, right? I think voters, I've run some 26 campaigns nationwide, been in a variety of battleground states, notably here in Virginia. What is that binary choice that you can give somebody from a messaging perspective? What is it? Column A, column B. Walk us through some column A, column B suggestions.
Well, the campaign in itself has a gift right now, and that is the unrest across the country, the destruction and desecration of our monuments, the radical behavior on the part of so many people. That's Exhibit A as to what the Biden campaign, at least in the Trump world, offers to America. This is the future. The future is defund the police, disrespect respect for our monuments and our history, however tarnished it may be. And they need to say that, and they need to say there'll be more of this if we don't elect President Trump. And they're not saying that. Again, they're coming up with cute little monikers, and they're wargaming and workshopping nicknames for Joe Biden. I think that worked in a Republican primary where the field was crowded, and he had to kind of out-shout and out-hustle everybody. But it's not going to work against an opponent who's not even responding. I mean, if I was advising the Biden campaign, what I would say is just keep your head down and your mouth shut. Trump's running against himself, and he's beating himself.
Well, yesterday, I don't know if you had the opportunity to see Joe Biden's press conference, but it really was a thing of beauty. He was handed a piece of paper that had every reporter he should call on, and he literally just read it off like it was attendance. You know, is Mike M. from NBC here? Mike M. It was one of the most catastrophically bad press conferences I've ever seen. And he's whether or not he's cogent or not is a totally different topic. But the Biden campaign obviously realizes that scripting their candidate, minimizing his ability to, have a gaffe, is critical because of, I believe, what you said, which is that the Trump campaign / White House, which there is a clear bifurcation there. The White House is able to advance policy, whereas the campaign amplifies said policy. So diving into policy, Eric. So let's talk about the White House side. Obviously, they're on a country unification kick, and we had Brooke Rollins on the show earlier, and she was just excellent, walking us through appeals to suburban voters. Not she can't say voters. I'm saying voters across the country, and I think that there's a lot of good things that they can do there, whether it's police reform, immigration reform. There's a ton to do, even with 5 months left. But what do you make of everything going on? We have the coronavirus pandemic. There's healthcare concerns. There's defund the police. Walk us through messaging from a White House perspective, and then we can marry the two for the listeners.
Yeah, Mike, I think it's a bit of messaging and also a bit of optics. There's a lot of things happening in the country right now around which the president could unify people. For example, during the riots and the unrest, he could have taken to the Oval Office and delivered a Reagan-esque speech a la after the Challenger explosion and said some words of wisdom to try to quell people's anxieties. But he didn't really do that. The speech he gave in the Rose Garden, I thought, was bellicose and belligerent, and it made him look like a bully. It didn't make him at all look like a unifier. So it's one thing to say you're going to enact policies and suggest policies from a White House level that unify people, but when the president is out tweeting things that contradict those unity principles, it's a problem for the campaign. I mean, if I were Brad Parscale, I would try to find a way to put a moratorium a week or two, if even, on some of the tweets, so the volume of the tweets at least. I don't think the president will ever put his phone away. But you can't have a unity policy platform and then have the optics of a president doing things that don't look like he's unifying the country. And I think that's really the central problem of the campaign. It's the lack of ideas and then the behaviors and the optics on behalf of the president that contradict any effort to promote any kind of unification and ideas.
Well, so one thing I will say, and this is, unfortunately the reality of living in, the year of our Lord 2020, dash coronavirus. The president, when he goes out and he gives these rally speeches, they're able to distill that down into core messaging tenets that they can then go forth and use. And largely the campaign, I think, has used the president's speeches as a, temperature check on, one, what the president cares about the most, but then two, you're looking at a live audience, test group. What do they react to? What matters to them? And this was why 2016 was...
Ever.
Yeah.
Yeah, more than ever, Mike. People need to hear the message of safety and security, and that applies to coronavirus. It also applies to just general public safety in the time of corona. You don't want to be forced to have to pull out weapons and protect your home if there's protesters swarming outside your house, because either the police won't or can't do their job, or because they've been defunded. So the president needs to say, I'm the president who's going to run on safety and security. but he needs to show it in terms of his leadership on coronavirus especially. And then he also needs to be the president of prosperity. He has done things to make America more prosperous these last few years. He's stopped talking about it. He's really talking about Democrats in terms of bad Americans and bad people, and I think that's turning off middle-aged, college-educated white voters, especially females. Those are not messages that resonate with independents. The messages that resonate with independents are those that tether to an idea of how he will make the country better economically. And he has yet to lay out 3 to 5 things that he's going to do to make that happen.
Well, let's look at the last quarter for the markets. Dow, best quarter in 33 years, almost 18% up. NASDAQ, over 30% up in 90 days. 401ks are booming. I mean, there is a lot for this president to go out and talk about. But this,
There's a lot to talk about, but I think what he's misreading is there's a general temperature, a zeitgeist in our culture right now with an incredible amount of momentum behind it to attack capitalism and say that capitalism as a system is simply not working for everybody. And I don't believe that. But I think that a lot of people would say, well, the stock market's up and that benefits the rich, but what about the rest of us? And President Trump needs to quickly find a way to defend capitalism and free markets and say that that is the best way, and police, and that is the best way to reestablish the middle class, not to defund the police, not to tear down institutions, and not to tax our way to poverty and impoverishment. We'll turn ourselves into a second-rate country overnight if that happens. And he's not making that kind of argument. He's levying personal attacks against people in the media that I think incredibly distract and occlude his argument.
This is Mike Rubino, guest hosting for John Fredericks. We have Eric Bovim on the line. Eric, we were just discussing messaging, both White House and campaign. But, with our last 4 or 5 minutes here, let's talk about policies that they can move towards over the next 5 months that will be a critical component of re-election, right? You have this push for police reform, which Tim Scott admirably stood up on the floor of the U.S. Senate, and exclaimed why it was important to pass police reform. We're still in the middle of coronavirus. There's going to need to be more than $1,200 going to some people, as you see states like Texas, Florida, Arizona spiking in cases. Talk to me about what you see policy-wise that this administration can do. And I know that you've worked on a wide host of issues, whether it's in the healthcare space or in the tariff space. So explain to our listeners what you think.
Yeah, I mean, look, the president had an incredible run up to Corona in March. Unemployment was at an all-time low for just about every category you can imagine.
Yep.
So if we start from that point, the president needs to go back and talk about how is he going to get these 20-plus million Americans who've lost their jobs due to Corona back to work. Is that an infrastructure plan? Is that more unemployment benefits? Is that tax cuts? What it really is, how do you jumpstart the economy? And there's no person better to talk about that than the president, but he's got to do it in positive terms. He's got to start saying, here are the things, the policies, the programs that we need to implement to get America working again and to get ourselves reestablished as an economic powerhouse. And I'd add one more thing, Mike, about police reform. The George Floyd tragedy was absolutely unacceptable and uncalled for, and those men should be in prison for a long, long time for what they did to that person.
Mm-hmm.
That said, we need to start asking the question, why is there crime at such a high rate in some of our cities? Why is there unrest, and what are the problems? The problem is we've desecrated our middle class and sent jobs overseas.
Right.
And in some cities, the economics, they don't work for people to be satisfied with their life and their homes. There are a lot of broken homes in some of these inner cities, and the president needs to start to get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is not police. Police are reacting to a symptom of a socioeconomic problem that's much greater than that. And his policies need to start addressing why in Baltimore and Chicago are the murder rates sky high and in some places higher than they'd be in El Salvador. I mean, the president gets excoriated for criticizing Baltimore for being a dangerous place, but when in fact it is an incredibly dangerous place that needs to look at the policies locally that it has implemented for the last decades that have left it in some way, shape, or form kind of a third world country.
Well, I'm looking at a Washington Post article, and I'm just going to walk through it quickly for the listeners. So the title is Trump keeps claiming that the most dangerous cities in America are all run by Democrats. Period. They aren't. Period. So it's by Philip Bump. It's an analytical article basically trying to pick apart what the president's saying. And Eric, you're making the same argument as the president. So let me then go and tell you what the fake news has to say. They put together a graph. It's this beautiful graph. It has some 20 cities on it with violent crime. There are all blue lines next to them. All of them, Democrats, except for two, which are independents, and one city has a Republican mayor. One city. So they're saying that his claim is false because Jacksonville, Florida, where the 2020 convention will be, has a Republican mayor. Therefore, not all cities have high violent crime with Democrat mayors, because there is one city with a Republican mayor and two cities with an independent mayor. Though, as we saw with Michael Bloomberg, he's essentially a Democrat. He was an independent mayor. So I think that your point is extremely well taken, because you have the fake news media who kind of knows that they're wrong, but they put out these articles assuming that people won't read them. But what can people do to kind of combat that? What would you suggest that we do to combat this? It's very scary. It's a very scary time to be alive. I drove past graffiti last night. There's just this palpable sense of tension in the air. And with our last minute, Eric, what do you think is the best resolution to put forth?
I think that the president's true goal, and the campaign should convince him of this, is to stop his war on Democrats and his war on fake news. It's not that Democrats are bad people, far from it. He needs to enact a war of ideas against crime, against impoverishment, against progressiveness that is going to erode the fundamental values of the country. And that won't turn off voters as much as his war against people that are Americans. And, vilifying half the country is not going to get him reelected. And vilifying the media, I think people become immune to the complaints, and I think they've stopped seeing fake news, such as it's called, for what it is. I think they're starting to wonder if Trump's even correct about these things. So he needs to promote his ideas. He needs to stop attacking people who might vote for him or thinking of voting for Democrat candidates. And he needs to show himself as aligned with America's values and not simply a candidate who's for Trump.
Eric, excellent analysis as always. Thank you so much for joining. This was Mike Rubino, guest hosting the John Fredericks Radio Show.